Today we're going to look at Acts chapter 19. And the verses we're going to focus on primarily are going to be right there about verse 23 through 41. Through the end of the chapter, I believe. And but there's some interesting lead up to this, and I'm going to touch on just a few verses prior to the primary passage for today. Paul had continued to move around. He and some other individuals had continued on in their missionary journey, and actually we are at a point where they are pretty well into their third missionary journey, and they are at Ephesus, a pretty important city center. And really what was going on here is summed up pretty well if you want to look there in Acts chapter 19, verse 20. That verse really sums up what is happening, and it just says simply, "So the word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing." What we're going to look at today, much of what we're going to look at today, is a natural occurrence of what happens when multiple individuals go forth and proclaim a message that, though it is true, runs contrary to popular beliefs, opinions, worldviews of the time. And there's conflict that's going to arise at some point. And it's just the things that were occurring in this city would only have been possible at the hands of genuine believers, men who believed in the message. In fact, there's a very interesting occurrence here where some Jews try to mimic what these men are doing, try to mimic and imitate a genuine miracle, and they try to exorcise a demon. And the demon addresses these men and says, "Well, we know Jesus and we know Paul. Who are you? Who are you guys?" And the possessed individual just jumps these guys, beats the tar out of them, and sends them running. And so the fakers are sent running. And so, but I wanted that verse 20 there. The word of the Lord was growing mightily and prevailing. Well, so what was going to occur here? Well, there's a riot, a major riot that starts here. And as we look at this passage, it's important for us to see today there's some major takeaways here, things that we, I think, can emulate and things for us to avoid as believers, because really what we are called to do is the same thing these guys were doing. We are called to go out into the world and to proclaim the message, and that's not going to be easy. As time goes, in fact, I would say as time goes on, if you are consistent about that, about proclaiming the truth, about confronting the wrongs, the evils, the sins of this world, sooner or later something's going to occur, because at this point Paul had been in this area for quite some time, 2 to 3 years, and things just built up and built up and built up, and a line, I guess, was crossed. So let's start here in Acts chapter 19, and we're going to begin in verses 23 through 27. It says, "About that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way," Christianity. "For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours falls into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence. Really interesting passage. So, Paul at this point has determined that eventually he wants to go back to Jerusalem, but eventually he wants to end up in Rome. And we know that he does. He does end up in Rome. But this is kind of the first, here pretty close to this, we see that he desires to do that. But for the time being, he just really feels the need to stay in this area. And it may have been because of the events that end up occurring here, even though he is not directly involved. So a large disturbance arose in the city. Now, ultimately, what lay at the heart of this strife, this thing of contention, was demonic activity. Satan will always oppose, to one degree or another, any effort to proclaim Christ to a lost world. As believers, I don't want you guys, most of you probably already realize this, but you cannot expect to go out and confront the institutions and the powers that be in this world that are held captive by sin and Satan. You can't keep winning major victories for the Lord and expect no pushback of any kind. It's gonna happen. The world and its ways and its worldviews, there's gonna be pushback. And as we see here. So, and in fact, I would say the greater your degree of zeal and fervor for the Lord, the sooner and quite possibly the sooner you're going to get pushback, and the greater quite possibly that pushback is going to be. Now, so who was the main individual here? Well, it was a guy named Demetrius. He was probably a prominent, wealthy craftsman of these idols that were dedicated to the worship of Artemis. And this was a big, big deal. We kind of look at this and really don't have much context. We don't understand, well, why would that be that popular? Well, worship of this particular deity in this area was huge, huge. The Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. And across the empire, it's estimated that at this time there were no fewer than 33 major shrines or temples dedicated to worship of this goddess. So it was, Artemis worship was probably the largest cult at this time. So Paul and his group were coming up against a major group of individuals that believed far differently than they did. Now, as Demetrius addresses this crowd, it's important to see, how does he appeal to them? Well, the first and primary focus was just personal gain. Hey, if we continue to let this new teaching thrive, we're going to lose all our money. One of the ways that you are going to get the attention of those powers that be that would come against Christianity is if it starts hitting them in the pocketbook. You are going to get the world's attention fast if you hit them in a monetary way, if they start losing money because of Christianity. Now, the proclamation of the gospel in this area was causing many individuals, hey, praise the Lord. They were forsaking idolatry. They were committing their lives to Christ. That's a good thing, but it had consequences. Demetrius next focuses on the crowd's devotion to the gods. His concern was that eventually the temple and the worship of Artemis would just be worthless. Well, that is what happened in the end. But at this point, they were still pretty concerned about this. And then he ends with a plea to the civic pride of his fellow Ephesians. And that's something also, civic pride, I think, is kind of a hard thing for us as Americans. A lot of us may have a high degree of national pride, but civic pride is a little bit different. And so the combination of these things really stoked the fire of this group, because they began to realize, well, if Christianity has its way, the economy is going to crumble. Our reputation as Roman citizens are going to be eroded. And so there's these things going on, but also, and I think this even is more important to see, it's important to see and understand why the new church was having this kind of effect on, particularly on an area this large. What was it about what the Christians were doing that was causing this level of resistance? Well, first, it was due to the total commitment and relentless labor of one man sold out to the gospel and to God. Miller just got done on Wednesday evenings, this past Wednesday evening, and the one before, he gave a really good two-part series on the difference one guy can make. One guy at the right time, in the right situation, can make a pretty big impact. And Paul made that impact. Why? Because he was dedicated. In fact, if you jump to the next chapter, in Acts chapter 20, as Paul is saying farewell to the Ephesians, he told them, "For 3 years I didn't shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God." Paul just didn't back down. He was wholly devoted to the cause of Christ and the expansion of the gospel message. Second, the thing that was happening because of that is that the church was being purged. There was a large group of individuals that were reprioritizing their lives and purging sin from their lives. In fact, just a few verses prior to the passage we're looking at, look at Acts chapter 19, verses 18 and 19. It says, "Many also of those who had believed kept coming, confessing and disclosing their practices. And many of those who practiced magic brought their books together and began burning them in the sight of everyone. And they counted up the price of them and found it 50,000 pieces of silver." So there was a serious revival going on here, and it was evidenced by a widespread turning from the things of sin and darkness. Magic, occultism, they were burning that stuff. Why? Because they had come face to face with the truth. And they realized, rightly so, we don't need any of this junk. We just need the Lord. We need God. We need Jesus. And so that's something that was happening. But again, though, that was hitting some of the powers that be in this area. It was hitting them in the pocketbook. Well, wait a minute. People are no longer buying this stuff. And in fact, they're burning what they do have. And so it was pretty serious. And then this one, I think, really, this is kind of, it's implied here, but this is, I think, a really important one, guys. Really important. The church, the individuals, the Christians in this area used proper methods. What do you mean by that? Well, you notice what isn't happening here. They didn't lobby political officials. They didn't picket the silver shops. We don't hear of Demetrius or anybody close to him getting killed or beat up. They didn't hold major rallies against Artemis worship. Yes, probably some of these people, if they were asked, hey, do you think this is wrong? They probably would have said, yes, it's wrong. But they were focused primarily on just living out the gospel and letting its power push out wrong belief. I'm really glad that Millard mentioned something in Sunday school today, because I think it's very important. Millard doesn't roll in to IQVIA every day hollering and screaming about the Lord. He could, but that would get him rolled out of there pretty quick. But people know he's a believer. They know he proclaims Christ as the only way to salvation. People will email him wanting him to pray for them. And if people come to him and ask, hey, what's your opinion on this? He'll say, well, you asked. And so I'm going to tell you what I believe and what my opinion is. That is an appropriate model for how we are to engage in the world. You know, do we need to stand against, let's just pick some abortion. Do we need to stand against abortion? Yes. Do we, when we're in a conversation with someone, need to speak for the sanctity of human life? Yes. Do we need to firebomb clinics? No. We're not called to that. Why? Because it's violence. We're just answering wrong with wrong. These individuals were simply standing for the gospel. And I think that's something that we really need to look at in our lives. Are there times, are there situations in which we are called to resist the sin and the evil of this world? Yes, but we need to do it appropriately. We need to do it appropriately. Okay, moving on, let's look, we're going to look at some of the characteristics of the riot. We looked at the causes, what really got it going. Well, what are some of the characteristics of the riot as it takes place, and what are some of the major takeaways there? Let's look at verse 28 in Acts 19. So, after Demetrius gets them whipped up, says, when they heard this, they were filled with rage and began crying out, saying, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. Some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and repeatedly urged him not to venture into the theater. So then some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. Some of the crowd concluded it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, and having motioned with his hand, Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose from them as they shouted for about 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Okay, there's 3 things that we need to look at here that are displayed. And right at the very beginning, we see the first one that I want to talk about, the first of the 3 characteristics we'll look at, and that is anger. It's just multiple individuals are just sent into a full-blown rage. There is a reason, guys, that there are multiple examples, Old and New Testament, across Scripture about not letting anger dominate your life. There is nothing good that comes from allowing anger to control a situation or our lives. And I'm not talking about righteous anger. I'm talking about, I want to tear somebody's head off anger. Just the kind of anger that just clouds out everything else. Anger breeds bitterness, jealousy, many other harmful attitudes and actions. And in this context, the gospel had angered these people because it confronted them with their sin and their empty lifestyle. It called them to something more. It told them, you're living inappropriately. You need to do something else. You need to change your lives. The problem was they just responded to it in the wrong way. And I would say this for us, guys, we've got to be very careful in our lives, in how we conduct ourselves, how we are standing as witnesses for God's truth, for the Word. We need to be firm as we defend our faith. But we've got to be very careful, guys, about crossing that line into outright anger and letting anger take control. Because really, nothing good comes from it. Nothing good comes from allowing anger to take control. Secondly, and this is pretty closely tied to anger, some of the things that happen. Secondly, we see major confusion. Major confusion. The crowd gets whipped up. They grab a couple of Paul's traveling companions, guys by the name of Gaius and Aristarchus. They took them into the main theater. They brought them into this area probably because they could just get a whole bunch of people around, and who knows, their intentions may have been to kill some people. Hey, we're going to get in here, we're going to get frothed up, and we're going to kill these guys. But what's really interesting here is that Luke tells us some people were shouting one thing, some people were shouting another, and he even goes as far as to spell out the majority of people didn't even know why they were there. Have any of you guys really, have you seen videos of, hopefully you haven't been a part of it, been a part of a real full-blown riot? Let me tell you, riots show the worst of humanity. Because it's what happens when people they let anger take control. They just let anger take control, and they don't know why they're doing it. You'll get half of it, we're just going to go along with this. And then, you look at the riots as a result of the beating of Rodney King in the early 90s. If you see some of that footage, it's just a bunch of people just, hey, let's go in here and steal. And then we're going to burn this shop down. And oh, here's this person. Let's just beat him up within an inch of his life. The riots that took place because of some of the events in St. Louis right there around 2014, 15. Some of the riots that have taken place as a result of white supremacists getting crowds whipped up. It's hatred. And we've got to be very careful. So why is it important to deal with what's important here about the confusion? As believers, we need to conduct ourselves in a way that places priority on unity and communication. Unity and communication. Not discord and, well, we're not going to talk about this. We're just going to let some stuff simmer, and then before you know it, it's just full-blown out of control. This situation could have transpired in an entirely different way if more right, godly things had occurred. And then last, so we see anger, we see confusion, and then as a result of all of that, mixed in with all of that, we see closed-mindedness. Closed-mindedness. So somewhere in here, a Jewish man by the name of Alexander gets up, and what he's really doing here is he is attempting to set himself and his fellow Jews apart from the Christians. What he's trying to do is throw the believers under the bus. Hey, we didn't do this, it's these guys. Because at this time, in the eyes of the Roman officials, there wasn't much, if any, difference between Judaism and Christianity. They all thought it was the same thing. Well, here, they had gotten so whipped up, they didn't care. They just didn't care. At this point, it just doesn't matter. The crowd ignores his arguments, and they just continue to shout, scream, holler for 2 hours. And I think it's important to see here that for us, there are going to be times we want to try to witness to people as much as we can. We want to always show those around us love, care, and compassion. But there are going to come points, guys, where you're going to recognize somebody has just walled it off. They don't want to recognize the truth. They don't want to see their lives and the situations in their lives for what they really are. They've just walled it off. And at that juncture, I would say never cease praying for them. But at that point, your efforts to evangelize to them may be better spent somewhere else. And there are some times where you just have to, as the biblical model talks about, you just shake the dust from your feet and move on. Does it mean even you will move on from that person permanently? No. You may have an opportunity at some point in the future to proclaim the truth to them again. But we need to be on the lookout for these things. These are the big takeaways from this. Avoid anger in your life. Really inspect your life and see, do I have an issue with anger? Controlling how I think, how I feel, how I react to those around me. Do I have a problem with that? Well, I could point you to holes in walls in former residences that have said, I've had past issues with anger. You can't let it take control, guy, particularly with men. I'm not saying that there aren't women that don't get really angry, but most of the time it's guys. And really, how often are you responding in just full-blown, out-of-control anger to a situation versus, wait a minute, let me just pray about this. Let me see what the Lord would have me do in this situation. Let me respond with a little bit of patience and understand. A lot of times, wives are just, Jory has saved me from, So many times you let anger take control and you don't even know what the situation is. And your anger has blown it up into something that it didn't even need to be. So really, watch out for anger. Also, confusion. Communicate with the people around you. Your spouse, your family members, church members. Communicate. Don't sit on stuff. Don't expect individuals around you to be mind readers. Now that doesn't mean you gotta be angry again or in their face all the time. Well, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. No, there's a way to come to people and speak to them. But keeping stuff bottled up is never wise. Never wise. So communication with the goal of unity. And then lastly, guys, understand that there are going to be times as we go out into the world, we're going to encounter pretty total and complete closed-mindedness in individuals. Sometimes all you can do is just pray for them. So last, let's close with how this thing kind of got calmed down a little bit, because it did. And it's interesting how it does. We'll just skim across these verses. This is verses 35 through 41. So after quieting the crowd, the town clerk, translation, the mayor, what we would think of as the mayor, said, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there, after all, who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guarding the temple of the great Artemis and of the image which fell down from heaven? So, since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and the proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed, we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events. And I think it had already gotten there. Since there is no real cause for it, and in this connection we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. After saying this, he dismissed the assembly. So, really, the critical thing to note in this last bit of verses before we close here is that because Paul and his companions had been model citizens, they had behaved in an appropriate way. They hadn't responded in anger and bitterness to these individuals. The mayor actually, in this context, temporarily ends up rebuking actually Demetrius and his crew more than anyone else. They didn't have any ammunition against the Christians. And that's one of the major things, guys, as we engage the world. That's one of the major reasons why we need to avoid things like anger, hatred, bitterness. Why? Because the world is watching. And let me tell you something, guys. There are groups and individuals out there who are just waiting to use your mistakes against you. We're not perfect. We're going to make them. But we've just got to be careful. And so, Paul and his missionary group, again, they had acted in the right way while in Ephesus, and they were rewarded for their behavior. Also, it's important to see the mayor's emphasis on using the law and lawful procedures. Now, there may come a day, guys, there is injustice out there, believe me. And I get pretty frothed up about it from time to time. But for as long as we can, as believers, until the day comes, quite possibly, where the law or the government or the powers that be are going to ask us to renounce our faith and choose between God and the government, or God and the law. We cross that bridge when we come to it. But until then, guys, be lawful citizens. Really. Don't take matters into your own hands. Work within the confines of the law. And a lot of that comes with avoiding anger. Don't let confusion reign supreme. Be willing to communicate in kindness, grace, love, compassion. Communicate with those things in mind. Let's pray. Father, we just thank you so much for this day and for yet another opportunity to fellowship with one another. Lord, I pray that you would be with each and every one of us. And that we would apply some of the things that these verses were speaking to in our lives. I pray that we would inspect our lives, how we are engaging the world, how we are conducting ourselves around our spouses, our friends, family members, co-workers, total strangers. Is anger a major part of how we engage the world? Has bitterness taken root in our lives? Are we seeking to really communicate with people out of a desire for reconciliation, in a sense of love, care, and compassion for those around us? Or are we holding grudges? Are we holding things back? Are we intentionally wanting to operate in a state of confusion and misinformation, misdirection? Father, I just pray that each and every one of us here would really look at those things in our lives, and that we would come to you in prayer and through reading your word, and that you would just confront us with any sin that exists, and that we would seek to make that right with you and with those around us. Also, Lord, I pray that as we go forth from this place, that we would understand that while there are probably going to be times where we're going to have an opportunity to proclaim your word and your truth, there are going to be individuals that shut us off, that don't want to talk about you, don't want to talk about what Jesus has done for them. And Lord, I just pray that when that time comes, that we wouldn't respond in anger or bitterness or resentment, but that we would just continue to pray for those individuals, because we've all been made in your image, and there are many, many, many out there who are lost and need to be reconciled. And even if they reject you, even if they don't want to talk about it, they still need you. And I pray that we would just continue to beseech you in that way, that hearts would be softened, eyes would be opened,